we're going to look at how you actually prompt AI. How do you create effective prompts that actually give you some high quality output that you can then use? And I will just say it's really fantastic to see so many people adding questions to the Q&A or into the chat. It's great. I've addressed some of these and others that we will address throughout the session, or we can address them during the Q&A section. So let's just get right into it. And what is prompting? We've looked at it a little bit already, but a prompt is an instruction or a question or a set of instructions and questions that you provide to a Gen AI tool to ask it to do something for you. Prompts provide the Gen AI model with the context it needs for it to guess what you want and generate something in response. Effectively, what your prompt is doing is pointing the Gen AI tool to look in the right place within its understanding of language. So if you think of that cloud above the AI model that we looked at earlier, your prompt is helping to point the Gen AI model into the right place within that cloud to find the right order of words to create an output for you. Now, before I go too much further, I just want to emphasize that Gen AI is weird. And by that, I mean Gen AI is probabilistic. So that means it uses statistics and probabilities to guess what you are most likely trying to say and to guess the most likely output to give you. And it's also complex in that its understanding of language is encoded in that neural network that we spoke around. So ChatGPT, that has trillions of these neurons that all are interacting with each other, sharing numbers between each other, and that's how it understands language. So it's complex like that. And if any of you know a little bit about how complex systems work, you'll know that that can make it really hard to predict what the system is going to do even if given the same kind of input. And so this means that the relationship between prompt and output is not always predictable. Advanced Gen AI models are also constantly showing emergent unintended behavior. This means that the Gen AI models can exhibit behavior that even the designers of those systems didn't necessarily predict or expect to happen. So for example, it's been shown that adding to your prompt to ask the Gen AI to take a deep breath actually gives you better results. So if you just write in your prompt, take a deep breath, it's been shown that that can give you better results, which is, of course, weird because the Gen AI model obviously doesn't actually breathe, doesn't have any lungs. It doesn't actually need to relax. It's just a machine. But putting that into your prompt can produce better results, which is weird. Now, you could try to make some explanation for that in that the AI model has learnt that if humans are more relaxed, that they will create better results. It may have learnt that saying take a deep breath is a way of getting humans to relax. But these are sort of rationalizations or explanations that we come up with after the fact. We can't really know for sure that that is actually what's happened here. So in that way, Gen AI models are weird in that they exhibit behavior we wouldn't normally necessarily predict. And using the same prompt, that 5 minutes apart in the same tool, you can't always predict that it's actually going to give you the same result every time because it's probabilistic. So as I've been saying, you can't always explain why Gen AI behaves the way it does or why some prompts work. That said, there is general advice and general good practice that we can follow to more reliably get good results. So here's just some proof of generative AI's weirdness before we go into the more practical details of how to prompt these things. Some academics recently did some research on the most effective prompts for reliably answering maths problems. Now, the fact that a Gen AI model trained using a large language model can even answer maths problems at all is kind of weird. At least to start with, most of these tools weren't specifically trained to answer maths problems. It learnt how to do maths problems simply by learning how language works. And it's learned how language works using things like maths textbooks, for example. So the fact that they can answer maths problems at all is a little bit weird. But recently there was some research into what would make the most effective prompt for reliably answering maths problems. They fed a whole heap of possible types of prompts into AI and saw which of these prompts most reliably generated correct answers. And if we take a moment to think about what some of those might be, some of those kinds of prompts might be, it's really important to think step by step, or it's really important to be precise. Or if you know a little bit about prompting already, you might think, let's give the AI a persona to tell it you are an expert maths, you're a maths expert. But for some reason, what seems to work, at least according to this research paper, was that if you pretend that you and the AI are in Star Trek together or are in a political thriller novel, for some reason, that seemed to generate more reliable, accurate results to solve a maths test. We don't know why. It's weird. So the answers for what is the most effective prompt to come up with can sometimes be a bit strange and not really self-explanatory. Which is why I don't really call it prompt engineering. So you'll see some people call crafting the Gen AI prompts prompt engineering, which can be a legitimate way to explain it. But I feel like prompt engineering implies that prompting is more scientific or predictable or structured than it really is in most of the tools that we would be using day to day. So I think of prompting as a little bit more like an art than a science, in that it's something that you get better at through practice, through using the tools and building a bit of an intuition around what makes a good prompt for that particular tool in the way that that works. And to improve on that over time as you use the AI models more and as the AI models actually learn and get trained on different data. That said, there are good practices we can learn. There is some good practice that we can follow to, in general, get more reliable results. One of those best practices is to remember that Gen AI cannot read your mind yet. Now, perhaps one day Elon Musk's project to develop a chip that implants in your brain will come true. Now, personally, I hope that doesn't come true, but for now, Gen AI cannot actually read your mind. So however you approach prompting, the goal is to provide enough context and specific instructions so the Gen AI model doesn't need to guess what you want. You provide it with enough context so that it knows exactly where to look in its understanding of the structure of language to create the right order of words to answer your prompt in a way that will actually meet your needs. One way to do this is to provide short sentences. So write clearly. Avoid ambiguity, so that each of your short, clear sentences only really has, if possible, one way of interpreting what it means. You want to be specific, so provide specific details of what you want the AI model to do and what you want it to create. And you want to provide as much context as you can. So to almost pretend that you're asking another person to do this for you. Think through what is all of that background information that a person might need to do this task. The more that you provide to an AI model, the less it has to guess, and the more it can create a high quality response for you. So to do this effectively, you should have a clear idea of what you are actually trying to achieve. So using generative AI, in most cases, is not really a shortcut to knowing about a topic, and its output is only really as good as the prompts that you provide it. So in order to stop the Gen AI having to guess, you need to know a little bit about the topic that you're trying to get it to work within, both to create an effective prompt and also to critically evaluate whether the result that it gives you is actually accurate and is actually representing the real world. Now, if you only have a vague idea of what you're trying to achieve or a vague idea of a topic, so if you're trying to use AI to teach you about a new skill or a new concept, for example, having a backwards and forwards conversation with the Gen AI chatbot can help you refine your ideas, but it can't replace your human judgment and reasoning. Fundamentally, as we'll learn in a second, it's still the human using the tool that is ultimately responsible for the quality of the output that's created and how the output is then used in practice. So there are two broad ways to prompt, and this is how a person who's working in the space a lot, somebody called Ethan Mollick, who's from the Wharton School of Business, he's presented there are two main ways to prompt, and I think it's a good way to sort of think about prompting. You could start by having a conversation with Gen AI and gradually improve on its results through a backwards and forwards exchange. And we'll come to how that actually works in just a second. Or you could craft a structured prompt with clear, specific instructions and enough context to make the Gen AI's first response as close as possible to the output you need. Now, these two ways of approaching prompting aren't mutually exclusive, of course. In order to have an effective conversation with the Gen AI, the prompts that you give it still need to be clear and specific, and some of the tips that we'll see in creating structured prompts will also work in creating prompts that you put into a backwards and forwards conversation. And similarly, if you craft a structured prompt, it's unlikely that the first result you get back will actually be useful for you, and it's generally not a good idea to just use the first thing it gives you. That you will still have to have a little bit of backwards and forwards to refine what it gives you and make it actually fit and also reflect the real world. So let's dive into actually having a conversation, a backwards and forwards conversation with AI. A good way to approach prompting, particularly at the beginning, if you haven't got much experience using Gen AI before, is to treat it almost like a well-read friend, tutor, colleague, or intern working for you, and start a conversation with it. Simply start by asking it to create something, and then see what it comes up with and respond with more prompts in return to gradually improve on its output. Now, of course, the Gen AI is not actually a friend, tutor, colleague, or intern. It's just a machine, but it can be a useful way to think about that. So I'm going to demonstrate how that might work. So here I've opened up Microsoft Copilot, which is one tool for creating generative AI output, text and images. So Microsoft Copilot in balanced mode is very similar to the free version of ChatGPT. And Microsoft Copilot in creative mode is more similar to the capabilities of the paid version of ChatGPT. We'll come to some of the differences in tools in a little bit later on. But let's just say that I want to create a blog post about why dogs are better than pizza. You might disagree with me, but we could even generate the blog post to come up with both points of view. So I'm going to approach getting AI to help me create this blog post in a conversational way, in a bit of a backwards and forwards conversation. So I'm just going to tell it, I want to create a blog post about why dogs are better than pizza. And I want it to give me some ideas for how to approach it. Let's say 3 ideas. I want 3 ideas of how I might approach this blog post. Hopefully it creates it. There we go. It just took a little bit of time. So it's come up with some possible ideas. So the first idea it's come up with is loyalty versus leftovers, comparing the emotional benefits of pet ownership versus the temporary satisfaction of food. That's one way that I could approach this blog post. Another way might be the health benefits, that pizza is a little bit unhealthy, but that dogs promote an active lifestyle. That's one way to do it. The joy of training, that's a new one. So I've done this example a few times, and every time I do it, it comes up with slightly different examples, which is an example of how that prompts that you use are not always predictable. So that reward teaching and training a dog gives you some reward in itself. It gives you a sense of achievement that you can't do in the similar way of ordering and eating pizza. So that's cool. You know what? I'm going to try the third one. So say I like option 3. Great. I'm going to ask it to create a title for me. So it will take that option 3 and it will then generate a title for me. Pause for thought, the unleashed potential of dog training over pizza ordering. Now, let's say I think that title's too long. I don't like the use of the colon in there. I want it to be a little bit more snappy. So I could just tell it that. Make it more, make it shorter, and don't use a colon. And let's say I want it to use more alliteration. May or may not have spelt that correctly. So let's see what it does with that. Perfect pause, training triumphs over pizza pleasure. So you see in this conversation, it added alliteration, but it didn't actually get rid of the use of a colon. And so if I wanted to keep refining that, I would then also try it again to try to get rid of that colon from that title. I could then say, all right, now write the first sentence for me in 3 different ways. I want one of the ways to sound funny and one to sound serious. Let's just take it like that. So in this way, I could engage it in a conversation. So I'm not simply asking the AI to create everything for me. I'm working with it in a conversation to find the final blog post that we'll actually want to create. And I could keep going on in this way. And just to answer Harley's question that's in the chat right now, there is actually a fairly big quality jump between GPT 3.5 that powers the free version of ChatGPT and GPT-4, which powers the paid version of ChatGPT and which powers the creative mode of Microsoft Copilot. There is actually a rather big quality difference, which perhaps if you've only ever used the free version of ChatGPT, you may have already noticed that some of these results that I'm getting are slightly more human-like and slightly more creative. But we'll come to some of that in a second and some of those things that you need to think about in picking the right tool. So that was a quick demonstration about using AI in a bit of a conversational way to gradually get to the kind of output that we want. The other approach to prompting is to craft structured prompts, which includes putting most of the context that you think the GenAI needs into your initial prompt. Now, remember that prompts do not reliably provide the same response every time. You could use the same prompt just 30 seconds apart and get very different results. And that's because it's probabilistic. It's trying to guess the most likely order of words, and there could be many different orders of words that are pretty much equally likely to appear in response to your prompt. So, but that said, it can be useful to save prompts that you've used and have found helpful to use again in the future. And it can be useful to look at collections of prompts other people around the internet have created to use for particular tasks. It can be useful to see if that works for you and to use that as inspiration for creating your own prompts. But we can't guarantee that those prompts will actually work every time and will always actually work for you. So some of the aspects of crafting structured prompts include giving the Gen a persona. That is, giving the Gen AI a role or a kind of person to emulate that can help give it enough context to create a high quality result. So I'll come to what that means in the next slide. You want to provide context and constraints. So you want to provide enough background information that the Gen AI can use to craft a response that actually is high quality. And also constraints. So constraints are things that you don't want it to do. If you don't want it to use certain words, tell it that. If you want it to be a certain word count, tell it that. What are those things that you want it to do? Tell it that. And you can get a higher quality result that way. In a similar way as if you were telling another person to do that. You want to give it a specific task and a goal. So you'll notice in that conversation that I was having, each prompt, I was telling it to do something specific. I wanted it to create some titles for me. And I told it some of the tone that I wanted those different titles, those first sentences. I told them a few different tones that I wanted those sentences to look like. You also want to define a goal. So what are you actually trying to use this output for? What is the actual end use for? Again, that can create some context to create output that will work for you. You can also define subtasks and specific steps. So if you tell the AI specifically, step by step, what are the actions it should go through to then get to a final result, will most often create a better quality result in the end. And again, we'll come to how that works and why in just a couple of slides. It can be useful to define the target audience. So who will actually be reading or using the output that you create? That can also help narrow down what kind of output the AI will generate. Defining the format of the output will also be useful. So if you want bolded headings with dot points and then dot points underneath those bolded headings, tell it that. What is the format and the actual form of the output that you want? Some tools allow you to generate PDF documents or Excel spreadsheets from what you're doing. So if you want a particular format, you should tell it what kind of format that you want. Otherwise, the tool will just guess and create something based on the statistics of what it's seen before. You also want to define the tone or the style of the output. So if you want something to be informal and friendly and funny, again, put that in your prompt. If you want it to be serious and more formal, tell it that. So these are all of the things that you could put in a structured prompt to be more reliably get a high quality result in return. So how does this work in practice? Well, let's start with providing a persona. Providing a GenAI a persona or a role for it to act as is a useful way for giving it context. So for example, if you wanted to learn more about quantum mechanics, you could tell it you are a friendly, helpful tutor who is an expert in quantum mechanics. And then you will then find the results it gives you is more likely to be helpful. It's more likely to act almost like it's a tutor trying to teach you quantum mechanics than if you just launch straight into the instructions. So to do this, you should think about who the Gen AI should pretend to be, what that kind of person might know, and how they should behave. Now, of course, the Gen AI is not actually simulating that person, really. It's still just guessing the right order of words that will actually meet your needs. But it's a useful thing that has been found to help and more reliably provide high-quality outputs. Another way you can get more reliable outputs is to think step by step, or to tell the Gen AI to think step by step. It can be useful to ask Gen AI to break down its tasks into subtasks, and then tell it to complete those subtasks in order. This method of prompting is called chain of thought. So if you go around and you Google tips for prompting AI, you'll often find that it suggests using a method called chain of thought. And that's just what this is, telling the Gen AI to think step by step and then go through those steps in order. You can either provide the steps yourself, so you could actually think through what those steps should be and tell it what steps it should go through, or you could simply prompt the Gen AI to think step by step. Or you could tell it, start by thinking through the steps that you need to take to answer this question, and then execute those sequentially. The reason this helps is that as we've seen the way that AI picks the right order of words, it uses the output that it's generated so far as context to figure out what the next subsequent word should be. So if it's already generated the first few steps of a process, it can use what it's generated there as context to do the next few steps. So if I was asking it to create the blog post, if I started off by saying, come up with some topics, and then said, come up with some titles, and then said, come up with a summary, it would then go do that sequentially in order and could use the topics that it's thought of to inspire what the title should be, rather than skipping straight to the end. So that's think step by step. Another way is to provide examples. So far, what we have been doing is something called zero-shot prompting. So this means that we are asking the Gen AI tool to create something completely from scratch and aren't providing any examples of the types of things it might copy. Providing examples is called few-shot prompting. So again, if you were to Google tips for prompting AI, you'll often come up with the instruction to try few-shot prompting. And that just simply means providing the Gen AI with examples from which it can get inspiration. Examples give the Gen AI model more context to draw from, in addition to what it has already learned through training, through that machine learning process that we looked at. Most Gen AI models have a cutoff point in terms of what training data it's been trained on. So for example, ChatGPT, I think it's around May 2023 is its cutoff point for the most recent data it's actually been trained on and that it's seen before. Anything published online after that, it hasn't actually seen before. But by providing examples, you can expand the amount of context it can draw from as inspiration. Similarly, any documents that you add to a tool that lets you upload documents also provides additional context for it to draw from. And some tools can even search the internet. So Microsoft Copilot, for example, or the paid version of ChatGPT searches Bing, searches Microsoft search engine, and pulls in what it finds there as additional context or as examples. So that can also help. You can either manually find examples of the kind of thing that you're looking for and provide it to GenAI, but I do need to emphasize, be careful with copyright. The creators of those examples, if the creators of those examples haven't provided permission, that can be in breach of copyright, actually, to take that material and put it into a tool. So particularly for things like course readings or for journal articles that we find. Strictly speaking, according to copyright law, we shouldn't actually be uploading that into these systems. I'll address that in a little bit more detail just a little bit later before the end of the session. You can also ask the GenAI to generate a whole list of options. Pick a few that are closest to what you want, and then provide them back to the GenAI as examples. So let's look at an example of a structured prompt. And this is actually a prompt that I used recently. So I used to have a car that had a problem. So I asked ChatGPT, the paid version of ChatGPT, how I might go about troubleshooting this problem. So I told it, you're an expert mechanic, specialized in 1990s Toyotas. You are friendly, helpful, very good at clearly explaining mechanical concepts to non-mechanical people. This is giving it a persona. I'm telling it the kind of role or person that I want it to kind of act as. I've said I don't know much about cars, which is true. I'm not really a car person. And I need help diagnosing a problem with my 1996 Toyota Celica SX. So that's giving it a task, and it's giving it some context, and it's giving it a target audience. Target audience is me, someone that doesn't know much about cars. I want you to explain that to me as if I don't know much about cars. I've told it what the problem is, so that's providing context, and a little bit more context around what the problem is and around when the problem started. I want the list of most likely problems that I can suggest to my mechanic. So again, it's giving it a goal and a target audience. Its target audience is both me, as someone who doesn't know much about cars, but also in a way that I can then communicate to someone who does know more about cars. I then tell it to start by asking any questions that would help narrow down the issue. So because I don't know much about troubleshooting car problems, I've told it to start by asking me questions that it would need to answer that. So for anything that I haven't already thought of, it will then ask me and I can provide it back to provide more context. I've then told it to think through the steps that it would need to take to make an informed answer. So that's chain of thought prompting. That's telling it to think step by step. And then I've told it to follow through on those prompts. And finally, I've told it what the output should look like. A few options of where I could tell a qualified mechanic to look for problems, and then suggest what the most likely problem would be. So that's an example of a structured prompt. I then told it, just to be more likely to get a high quality result, I've told it to take a deep breath and think step by step. Sometimes this is helpful, sometimes it's not. But again, like I said, GenAI can be weird. So sometimes it's useful just to see, does adding take a deep breath actually help or not?